The attitude of Islam towards slaves has been subject to a lot of fault finding. It is misunderstood by some that Islam has an inhumane approach towards slaves. The sensitivity of the topic requires it to be gone through thoroughly in order to avoid premature conclusions. Why is slavery not abolished in Islam? Islam is a religion that encourages humans to use their cognitive faculties. We can see this as Allah Himself says, "Indeed, the worst of living creatures in the sight of Allah are the deaf and dumb who do not use reason." This ayah in itself is an indication that Islam is a practical religion that will appeal to those who actually use their minds to understand the truth. Though this fact might seem unrelated to the question at hand, there is actually a direct link. Islam came at a time when social ills were at their peak. Islam came to solve the problems and provide guidance to those who had strayed away from righteousness. If the Quran had an ayah that would clearly say that keeping a slave or buying one is haram or not allowed, that would not stop those who weren't believers from continuing to buy and sell slaves and behave unethically with them. The fact at hand is that it was clear that abolishing slavery was not enough to ease the pains brought to the slaves by the world. The inhumane practices and attitudes that slaves had to face would continue regardless of abolishing slavery or not. The solution to this social illness was something else in the sight of Islam. The general treatment towards slaves was cruel in the pre-Islamic Arab society. The reality is that those slaves who were brought as commodities were oppressed by their so-called masters, and those who were captured as slaves after war were also treated horrendously. Both types of these slaves were exploited economically and sexually. They were usually made to work for hours at a stretch in extremely painful situations and had little to no rights. In the world we live in, it is common knowledge that you can buy anything you want if you have the cash and know where to look. The idea of black markets is a reality that Islam did not fail to account for. If slavery had been abolished, then black markets would have continued to work undercover, which would have made it difficult for anyone to free slaves from a life of torment. Those who were being bought and sold in such markets would then naturally find no help and would die without a fair chance at a true life. Slavery cannot simply be banned because it is a social problem that will continue to exist regardless of whether a certain part of the society stops buying or selling slaves or not. People would continue to suffer in such a case, and this is not something that should be permitted. What behavior does Islam ask for towards the slave? Islam wants to provide all humans a fair chance at life where their basic rights are fulfilled. Islam wants to provide all humans a fair chance at a respectable life where they may adopt the path of goodness. The compensation for such sins in Islam is freeing slaves. It can be inferred that Islam exhorts one to free slaves as it has assigned a high spiritual reward for the act. Freeing the slaves is an ideal that believers should strive for. The believers are asked to give the slaves freedom in return if they see any good in them. Instead of taking wealth from the slaves to free them, the believers are instructed to give slaves something from the wealth Allah has provided them. وَالَّذِينَ يَبْتَغُونَ الْكِتَابَ مِمَّا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ فَكَاتِبُوهُمْ إِنْ عَلِمْتُمْ فِيهِمْ خَيْرًا وَآتُوهُمْ مِنْ مَالِ اللَّهِ الَّذِي آتَاكُمْ. And as for those who ask for a writing from among those whom your right hands possess, give them the writing if you know any good in them, and give them of the wealth of Allah which He has given you. Surah 24, Ayah 33. The only restriction imposed on the slaves is that they cannot leave the lands until they have been granted freedom. Sometimes it was practically not possible to free the slaves, such as in the case of captives of war. After going to prison, war captives turned into bigger criminals than before. Islam provided a solution to distribute these war captives to homes as slaves so that they could be exposed to a positive environment. This would ensure that they got groomed towards the path of goodness. Once they were exposed to such an environment where righteousness existed, they might have had a change of heart. If the war captives left their old ways and adopted goodness, then they were treated as respectable members of the society. This is why it is said that slaves should be released when some good is seen in them. Another ayah that clearly encourages the believers to spend the wealth bestowed on them by Allah on slaves is وَاللَّهُ فَضَّلَ بَعْضُكُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ فِي الرِّزْقِ فَمَا الَّذِينَ فُضِّلُوا بِرَادِّ رِزْقِهِمْ عَلَى مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُهُمْ فَهُمْ فِيهِ سَوَاءٌ أَفَبِنِعْمَةِ اللَّهِ يَجْحَدُونَ. And Allah has preferred some of you above others in wealth and properties. Then those who are preferred will by no means hand over their wealth and properties to those slaves whom their right hand possesses, so that they may be equal with them in respect thereof. Do they then deny the favor of Allah? Surah 16, Ayah 71. Those that had not freed slaves had to provide their slaves with certain rights. Slaves are to be provided with the same clothing, shelter and food that the believer himself has. Exploiting the slaves is forbidden. Prophet ﷺ said, "Your slaves are your brothers and Allah has put them under your command. So whoever has a brother under his command should feed him of what he eats and dress him of what he wears. Do not ask them to do anything beyond their capacity, and if you do so, then help them." The whole society has been given the responsibility of taking care of the slaves. This is evident from the following ayah. وَأَنْكِحُوا الْأَيَامَ مِنْكُمْ وَالصَّالِحِينَ مِنْ عِبَادِكُمْ وَإِمَائِكُمْ إِنْ يَكُونُوا فُقَرَاءَ يُغْنِهِمُ اللَّهُ مِنْ فَضْلِهِ وَاللَّهُ وَاسِعٌ عَلِيمٌ. Get the singles among your married as well as those who are fit for marriage among your male slaves and female slaves. If they are poor, Allah will make them free from want out of His grace. For Allah has boundless resources and is all-knowing. Surah 24, Ayah 32. The society has been addressed and asked to make sure that those who are fit for marriage among the slaves are also married off. This is done to make sure that they do not transgress and commit sins. The slaves are put under the care of the society, and so they must make sure that the slaves are not put in a compromised situation where they cannot control their desire. The third person to accept Islam was Hazrat Zaid, who was one of the Prophet ﷺ's most beloved companions. Hazrat Zaid was kidnapped as a child and was sold off as a slave. He came under the care of Prophet ﷺ, where he received such kindness and compassion that he refused to leave the Prophet's company. His parents had managed to find Hazrat Zaid after years of searching and wished to take him back with them, but Hazrat Zaid asked them to leave him where he was, as he felt content in the company of the Prophet. This is the ideal that the Prophet set. If slaves were treated inhumanely in Islam, they would want to leave at the first available opportunity. This is evidence enough to delineate the fact that slaves are to be treated humanely as per the laws of Islam. Is it okay to establish sexual relationship with captive women without marriage? Many ulama claim that it is or was permissible to establish sexual relationship with captive women without marriage. Let's look into this matter closely before jumping to any conclusions. On one hand, it has been established that slaves are to be treated with such kindness and compassion that they are given extensive rights and eventually freed. On the other hand, some claim that it is acceptable to exploit female captives sexually without marriage. Reconciling these views is not possible for those who are sensible. In the pre-Islamic Arab society, sexual anarchy was widespread. In an age where the society being dealt with was obsessed with perverse practices, it was essential to restrict them gradually to ensure change. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed a series of ayahs to eliminate social illness like intoxication and sexual anarchy. Initially, the following ayah was revealed. إِلَّا عَلَىٰ أَزْوَاجِهِمْ أَوْ مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُهُمْ فَإِنَّهُمْ غَيْرُ مَلُومِينَ. And those who guard their chastity, except from their wives or those their right hands possess, meaning thereby the captives and slave women, for then they are free from blame. Surah 23 ayahs 5 to 6 and Surah 70 ayahs 29-30. So initially it was made clear that one can have sexual relationships with either their wives or their slaves. This ayah clearly restricts married men from being able to have sex with slaves because they already have lawful means to satisfy themselves. However, at this point it appears that those who are unmarried may have had sexual relationships with slave girls. Later, the following ayah was revealed. And whoever of you have not the means wherewith to wed free believing women, they may wed believing girls from among those captives and slaves whom your right hands possess. And Allah has full knowledge about your faith. You are one from another. Wed them with the permission of their own folks and give them their meher according to what is reasonable. They, the above said captives and slave girls, should be chaste, not adulterous, and not taking boyfriends. And after they have been taken in wedlock, if they commit illegal sexual intercourse, their punishment is half that of free and married women. This is for him among you who is afraid of being harmed in his religion or in his body. But it is better for you that you practice self-restraint, and Allah is oft forgiving, most merciful. Surah 4, Ayah 25. Now this ayah clearly directed that one should not establish sexual relationships without marriage, and if one is not in a position to marry free believing women, it is better for him to practice self-restraint. If one is still unable to control their desires, then it is better for him to marry a believing woman from amongst the slave women. Does the above ayah 425 contradicts with or repeal the previously repealed ayahs which allowed the unmarried males to have sex with slave girls, making those ayahs infructuous or invalid? No, neither of these happened. It simply changed their meaning, elucidating them in the new context. Let us have a look at that earlier order again. إِلَّا عَلَىٰ أَزْوَاجِهِمْ أَوْ مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُهُمْ فَإِنَّهُمْ غَيْرُ مَلُومِينَ. And those who guard their chastity, except from their wives or their captives and slave women, for then they are free from blame. Today, when we analyze these ayahs together with 425 quoted earlier, these ayahs would carry a modified meaning now. And those who guard their chastity, except from their wives or the captives and slave women, after marrying them, then they are free from blame. So we see that it's permissible to establish sexual relationships with slave girls only if one marries them. It is not permissible to establish sexual relationships without marriage, and if someone is unable to marry, he should practice self-restraint. We do not live in an age where the 25th ayah of Surah Nisa or Surah 4 is still unrevealed, and so we must make sure that we establish sexual relationships with only those who we are married to. If we are not married, we must practice self-restraint. To understand the stand of Islam on any topic, we must go through all the ayahs regarding the topic to have a holistic view. If one were to just pay attention to one ayah without consulting the other ayahs on the same topic, he would be at fault. Studying the ayah in isolation will not give a true and authentic sense of what Islam has to offer.